They didn't throw me out. They didn't beat me. They didn't scream that I wasn't wanted. They did something far more damaging. They raised me like I was temporary. Before I tell you how I took everything they believed belonged to them, before I tell you how I became the woman they now pretend they always loved, let me ask you something. Have you ever lived in a house where love was clearly assigned, and you weren't on the list? If that question stings like this video, subscribe and turn on notifications. This story isn't just mine. It's for anyone who learned early that family doesn't always mean safety. Now let me tell you how it really began. My name is Elena Ward. And for as long as I can remember, I existed on the edges of my own family. In our house, affection had rules. It had conditions. And it had a favorite. My younger sister, Marissa, was everything my parents ever wanted. Soft-spoken, beautiful, fragile in a way that made adults rush to protect her. She had a laugh that filled rooms and a smile that convinced people she could do no wrong. She was the child my parents displayed. I was the child they used. From the outside, we looked like a normal family. A modest house. 2 daughters. A working father. A mother who claimed she sacrificed everything. But inside that house, roles were assigned early, and they were never equal. Marissa was the daughter. I was the responsibility. My earliest memories don't involve bedtime stories or being tucked in. They involve chores. Standing on tiptoe to reach counters. Folding laundry that smelled like my parents instead of myself. Learning how to move quietly so I didn't get in the way. By the time I was 7, I knew the rhythm of the household better than anyone. When to speak, when not to. When my mother's voice meant do it again. When my father's silence meant you've disappointed me. Marissa's room was upstairs, bright and warm, with posters and toys and shelves filled with books my parents bought her just because she liked them. Mine was downstairs next to the laundry room. It's practical, my mother said. What she meant was convenient. When guests came over, Marissa sat with them. She showed off her piano lessons, her drawings, her stories. I stayed in the kitchen, refilling drinks, carrying plates, wiping counters before anyone noticed they were dirty. People loved to comment on me. She's so mature for her age. They never realized maturity wasn't a gift. It was survival. My mother believed discipline built character, but only for me. If Marissa forgot to clean her room, it was because she was overwhelmed. If I missed a dust corner, it was proof I was lazy. My mother inspected my work the way a supervisor inspects a mistake. You missed a spot. Do it again. You should be grateful. Grateful for what I never knew. My father wasn't loud or violent. That was the hardest part. He didn't yell. He didn't hit. He simply didn't see me unless something needed fixing. He remembered Marissa's birthday months in advance. Planned dinners. Bought gifts. He forgot mine twice. When I reminded him once, he said, "Don't be dramatic." I stopped reminding him. If Marissa cried, both my parents rushed to her side. If I cried, my mother asked what I'd done wrong. By 10 I learned not to cry. By 12 I learned not to ask. By 14 I understood something important. Love in our house wasn't about effort. It was about preference. The night everything finally shattered happened when I was 16. Marissa had snuck out again. She always did. Rules bent for her. Consequences evaporated. That night she came into my room, nervous and angry at the same time. "If they ask," she said, "say I was with you." I looked at her and did something I'd never done before. Said no. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just said no. Her face changed instantly. She shoved me. Slip. My head hit the counter. Pain exploded across my face. Warm blood poured down my nose and onto my shirt. I screamed. My mother rushed in. She went straight past me. "Oh my God, Marissa, are you okay?" she cried, gripping her arms. I was on the floor. My father followed, looked at the scene and sighed, not in concern but in irritation. He looked at me and said, "What did you do to make her so angry?" That sentence rewired something inside me. I realized then that I could bleed in front of them, and they would still look at her first. That night, alone in my room with a swollen face and dried blood on my collar, I stared at the ceiling and understood a truth that would shape the rest of my life. I was alone. Not abandoned. Not rejected. Replaced. From that night on, I stopped trying to earn love. Instead, I planned my exit. College wasn't meant for me, according to them. Money was tight. Marissa needed support. Her future mattered. Mine was described as uncertain, a polite word for irrelevant. So I worked. Before school. After school. Weekends. Holidays. I saved every dollar where they'd never look. I applied to colleges in secret. I filled out forms late at night when the house was quiet. When my acceptance letter arrived, I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. Pack. The morning I left, my mother reminded me to clean the kitchen. No hug. No goodbye. No, we'll miss you. I walked out with one suitcase and a strange sense of relief. They didn't chase me. They didn't call. And for years, I lived as if they'd never existed. Until one day, long after they'd written me off, my name suddenly became valuable. And that was when everything changed. Leaving home didn't feel dramatic. There was no final argument, no slammed doors, no tearful goodbye that could later be replayed in memory. I walked out quietly, carrying a suitcase that held my clothes and nothing else. No blessings. No expectations. No safety net. The world didn't open its arms for me that day. But it didn't push me back either. And for the first time in my life, that felt like freedom. The first year away from my family was the hardest. Not because I missed them, but because I didn't. That realization came with its own kind of grief. I had expected pain, guilt, longing. Instead, I felt lighter, quieter, as if I'd been holding my breath for 16 years and had finally exhaled. Still, freedom doesn't pay rent, and independence doesn't mean comfort. I lived in a cramped apartment near campus, the kind with thin walls and a radiator that hissed all night. I worked 2 jobs while attending classes full-time. I learned how to stretch meals, how to sleep 4 hours and function, how to keep going even when my body begged me to stop. College was the first place where no one knew my role. No one expected me to clean up after them. No one assumed my worth was tied to how useful I could be. Professors called me by my name. Friends asked my opinion and waited for the answer. That alone felt revolutionary. I wasn't special. I wasn't celebrated. But I was seen, and that changed everything. I studied obsessively. Not because I loved my major at first, but because I loved control. Knowledge felt like armor. I chose business and economics because they made sense to me. Systems, patterns, power flows. Who has leverage and who doesn't? I understood those concepts instinctively, shaped by a childhood where I had none. Every lecture felt like a map. Every exam felt like proof that I could survive in spaces where I was never meant to exist. I didn't go home for holidays. I told myself it was because of work, because of exams, because of distance. The truth was simpler. No one asked me to come back. My parents didn't call to check in. My sister didn't text. When I saw photos online of them together, birthdays, dinners, vacations, I felt something tighten in my chest, but I didn't look away. I needed to remember where I came from, even as I built something new. Money was always tight. I learned to live with that pressure humming in the background of my life. I worked late nights at a cafe, mornings at the library, weekends tutoring students who had everything I didn't. I watched them complain about their parents while using credit cards paid for by those same parents. I never judged them, but I paid attention. Privilege wasn't invisible to me. It was a language I was learning fluently. Somewhere along the way, survival turned into ambition. Not loud ambition. Not the kind that announces itself. Mine was quiet, strategic. I didn't dream about success in abstract terms. I dreamed about security. About never needing permission again. About never having to ask for help from people who could use it against me. After graduation, I didn't celebrate. Found a job. Then another. Then a better one. I moved cities. I learned how corporate power worked from the inside. How decisions were made in closed rooms. How confidence mattered more than competence. How silence could be more dangerous than mistakes. I watched men twice my age stumble through meetings while being praised for leadership, and I took notes. I learned when to speak, when to wait, when to let others underestimate me. Years passed without contact from my family. I told myself it didn't matter. But then something strange happened. They started calling. First it was small. A birthday text from my mother. A message from my father asking how work was going. I answered politely, carefully. I didn't offer details. I didn't ask questions. I could feel something shifting even then, though I didn't yet understand what it was. Later I found out why. Marissa's life wasn't unfolding the way they'd planned. She dropped out of college twice, changed directions endlessly, burned through money and patience with equal enthusiasm. The golden child was struggling, and suddenly I existed again. They never apologized. They never acknowledged the years of silence. They simply acted as if nothing had happened, as if absence was something we all quietly agreed upon. My mother began asking about my job. My father asked about my salary. The questions weren't curious. They were evaluative. Kept my answers vague. What they didn't know, what no one in my family knew, was that I was no longer surviving. I was rising. The turning point came at a networking event I almost didn't attend. I was tired, overworked, tempted to go home. Instead I stayed. I spoke to a man who listened more than he talked. Someone older. In control without effort. His name was Julian. Our conversations weren't romantic at first. They were intelligent, strategic, curious. He asked questions that weren't invasive but intentional. He didn't assume. He observed. When he spoke about business, it wasn't theoretical, it was practiced. He didn't need to impress anyone. Power followed him quietly. Over time, those conversations deepened. We talked about ambition, about family, about betrayal, though I never told him mine in detail. I didn't need to. He understood enough to know I was someone who had learned to stand alone. When I found out he was a billionaire, it didn't shock me. It explained him. What did surprise me was how little that mattered. Julian didn't rescue me. He didn't lift me up or save me from anything. He respected me, treated me like an equal long before I felt like one. Our relationship grew slowly, deliberately, built on shared values rather than fantasy. When we married, it wasn't a fairy tale. It was a merger. And when my family found out, that was the moment everything changed. Suddenly they were proud. Suddenly they were interested. Suddenly I was introduced as our daughter instead of Elena. They didn't realize something crucial. I hadn't married into power to escape my past. I had married into power to return to it, on my own terms. And while they were celebrating my success, I was remembering every moment they chose my sister over me. Every silence, every dismissal, every wound. I wasn't angry. I was ready. When my family re-entered my life, they did it gently, the way people approach something they don't fully trust yet. There was no dramatic apology, no confession of regret, no acknowledgement of the years they erased me. Instead, they behaved as if time had simply paused, as if distance had been a misunderstanding rather than a choice. My mother called more often. My father asked to meet for coffee. My sister sent messages filled with emojis and false warmth. They spoke to me like someone they'd always known, not someone they'd discarded. Let them. I learned early that confrontation alerts people. Silence confuses them. So I stayed calm, polite, pleasant. I listened more than I spoke. I answered questions without offering detail. I let them project whatever version of me made them most comfortable. They were curious, not about me but about what I represented now. My mother asked about my home first. Where did I live? Was it large? Was it secure? My father asked about Julian, his business, his influence. My sister asked questions that sounded innocent but weren't, about money, connections, opportunities. Every conversation carried an undercurrent of evaluation. I could feel them measuring me, reassessing my worth. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. That realization didn't bring satisfaction. brought clarity. They hadn't changed. They'd recalculated. When I visited them in person for the first time in years, the house looked the same, but smaller. The furniture was older. The paint chipped in places I remembered scrubbing as a child. The kitchen still smelled faintly of bleach and burned coffee. I stood there quietly, noticing details no one else seemed to see. Memory clung to the walls like residue. My mother hugged me tightly, her voice trembling as she said, "You look so successful." Not happy. Not healthy. Successful. My father smiled with pride that felt newly learned, as if he were practicing it. My sister hugged me last, her arms loose, her eyes scanning my clothes, my posture, my confidence. I could see calculation flicker behind her smile. They treated me like a guest, not family, an asset. At dinner, they told stories from the years I'd been gone. Marissa talked about her struggles with exaggerated drama, painting herself as misunderstood, unlucky, burdened. My parents nodded sympathetically, as they always had. I listened quietly, watching the familiar pattern unfold, and felt something steady settle inside me. This was never about fairness. It was about comfort. They'd built a world that worked for them, and I'd never fit into it. Later that night, my mother pulled me aside. Her tone softened, her expression carefully arranged. She told me how proud she was. How she'd always known I'd do well. How difficult things had been after I left. Not once did she say she missed me. Not once did she say she was sorry. I smiled and nodded, because by then I understood something essential. People rarely confess what they don't believe was wrong. Over the next few months, the invitations increased. Dinners, holidays, casual visits. I became a regular presence again. But this time I was observing, not participating. I noticed how my parents spoke about money when they thought I wasn't listening. How Marissa complained about not being supported enough. How my father asked indirect questions about Julian's business network. They wanted access. They didn't realize they were revealing themselves. Marissa was the first to slip. She asked me if Julian ever helped friends financially. If he ever invested in family projects. She laughed when she asked, but her eyes stayed sharp, focused. She wasn't asking out of curiosity. She was testing boundaries. I told her Julian believed strongly in independence. Her smile tightened. From that moment on, the dynamic shifted. Marissa became competitive, dismissive, subtly hostile. She criticized my choices, my tone, my presence, the same way she always had. But this time something was different. This time I didn't shrink. And she noticed. One afternoon, my father invited me to walk with him around the neighborhood. It felt strange. Intimate in a way our relationship had never been. He spoke about legacy. About regret. About how families need to stick together. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then he said something that finally exposed the truth. "You know," he said casually, "we always knew you'd be the successful one. We just didn't expect it to happen like this. Like this. As if my success were an inconvenience. As if it disrupted the narrative they'd written for me." I realized then that they didn't want reconciliation. They wanted repositioning. They wanted to rewrite history, to place themselves closer to my success than they'd ever been to my pain. And that was the moment revenge stopped being emotional. It became logical. I didn't want to hurt them. I didn't want to yell or accuse or expose old wounds. I wanted them to feel what it was like to depend on someone who didn't choose them. I wanted them to trust me, the way I once trusted them. And then, slowly, I wanted to let them realize who truly held the crown. But revenge isn't rushed. It waits until people believe they're safe. And my family was beginning to feel very comfortable around me. There's a moment in every long betrayal when anger finally exhausts itself. Not because the pain disappears, but because carrying it becomes inefficient. That moment arrived for me quietly, without ceremony, sitting across from my family at a Sunday lunch they insisted on hosting. My mother was talking about renovations they couldn't quite afford. My father complained about rising costs. Marissa scrolled on her phone, half listening, occasionally interrupting to remind everyone how stressed she was. I watched them all, and something inside me settled. They didn't need confrontation. They needed consequences. From that day forward, I stopped waiting for them to change. I stopped hoping for acknowledgement. I stopped imagining an apology that would never come. Instead, I focused on structure because systems don't rely on feelings, and power doesn't need validation. Began small. I stopped over-explaining. When my mother asked intrusive questions about my finances, I smiled and redirected. When my father hinted at needing guidance or connections, I offered general advice, never specifics. When Marissa asked if Julian could take a look at one of her ideas, I told her he didn't mix business and family. They weren't used to resistance from me. Even mild resistance confused them. And confusion creates imbalance. They began reaching out more frequently, their tone shifting subtly from casual to needy. My father's calls grew longer. My mother's messages more emotional. Marissa's texts oscillated between sweetness and irritation. They were circling me now, trying to understand where they stood. I let them circle. At the same time, I paid attention. I learned about their finances without asking directly. I noticed overdue bills on the kitchen counter, heard complaints about loans and stalled plans, watched how often Marissa borrowed money, and how rarely she repaid it. I listened when my father admitted he was thinking about downsizing, his pride cracking just enough to reveal fear underneath. They were vulnerable, not helpless but exposed. That's when I made my first real move. He offered help. Not money. Not outright solutions. Just support. I suggested a financial advisor, one I trusted. I mentioned a potential investment opportunity in vague terms. I spoke carefully, framing everything as optional, considerate, generous. My parents reacted with visible relief. Marissa reacted with suspicion. She sensed the shift before anyone else. "Why now?" she asked me one evening, her voice sharp despite the smile on her face. "You never cared about this stuff before." I met her gaze calmly. "People grow," I said. "Don't they?" She didn't answer. From that point on, my presence carried weight. My opinions were sought. My approval mattered. They began consulting me before making decisions. Small ones at first, then larger ones. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the axis of the family began to tilt. And the strangest part, they thanked me for it. They told me how responsible I was, how dependable, how mature. Words they'd never used when I was a child scrubbing floors and raising myself. I accepted the praise without emotion, because praise, I had learned, was often just leverage wrapped in kindness. Marissa didn't adapt as easily. She grew restless, defensive. She interrupted me more often, challenged my suggestions, tried to reclaim attention in ways that felt increasingly desperate. I watched her repeat the same patterns that had always protected her: charm, entitlement, expectation, and failed to understand why they weren't working anymore. She wasn't used to competition, especially not from me. One night, after a tense dinner, she cornered me in the hallway. "You think you're better than us now," she said quietly, venom slipping through the words. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt no urge to deny it. "I think I'm different," I replied. "There's a difference." She laughed, but her eyes were cold. "You wouldn't be anything without us." That was when I knew. She still believed the story they'd all told themselves, that I existed because they allowed it, that my success was an accident, that I owed them something for surviving what they caused. And my parents, they were starting to believe something else entirely. They were beginning to believe they needed me. The balance had shifted enough for me to feel it in every interaction. They waited for my responses, adjusted their tone around me, asked instead of assumed. It wasn't respect, not yet. It was dependence. And dependence, once established, doesn't disappear quietly. That was when Julian asked me a question I hadn't been expecting. "Are you sure," he said one evening, watching me thoughtfully, "that you know how far you want this to go?" I didn't answer immediately, Because the truth was, I did know. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. Once you understand the rules of leverage, the game changes. It isn't loud. It doesn't require threats or anger. It only requires patience, observation, and timing. That's what I learned as I watched my family stumble into the world I had quietly shaped around them. They came to me first for advice. My mother about investments, my father about business decisions, Marissa about trivial approvals. Every question was a thread I could tug. Every request was a door I could open or close. I made no rash moves. I smiled politely. I listened. I offered hints without giving solutions. And with each interaction their dependence grew. Marissa was the first to falter. She underestimated me, as she always had. She assumed that because I was the daughter they neglected, I lacked cunning, ambition, or taste for strategy. She began borrowing money without asking. Small amounts at first, and I let her. I observed. I learned where her weaknesses were, where her ego overshadowed her judgment. She sent frantic texts when she realized bills were due. She tried manipulating my parents to cover her mistakes. I did nothing at first. I let her panic grow. My parents, meanwhile, had no idea they were stepping into a carefully constructed web. They assumed I was helping out of generosity. My quiet patience was invisible to them. Every suggestion I made appeared as if I was merely being helpful. But in reality I was recording, observing, and mapping their habits. Habits I would use later when the time was right. It wasn't cruel. Not yet. It was precision, discipline, justice for years of neglect, of invisibility, of being cast aside. One evening my mother called me in a panic. "Elena, you have to help me. I miscalculated the property taxes again. I don't know what to do." Her voice trembled. Her eyes pleaded. I smiled softly. "I can help," I said. And I did, but not fully. I allowed her to believe she'd solved the problem herself, when in reality I had stepped in just enough to prevent disaster. The relief on her face was intoxicating. She didn't know she had just reinforced the pattern. If she needed security, she needed me. Marissa, sensing a shift in the wind, tried to act as though she was independent. She boasted about job offers, social connections, even trivial achievements meant to prove superiority. I listened and nodded, smiled. Internally I catalogued everything. Her arrogance would be her downfall, as it always had been. As months passed, I subtly tightened my influence. I introduced opportunities for my family that seemed casual but were strategic. A business connection for my father that required guidance I alone could provide. A loan for Marissa that required my approval. Invitations to social events where I was the bridge between them and resources they desired. With each gesture, they assumed I was being generous, unaware that I was shaping them to my advantage. Then came the pivotal moment. Marissa made the first irreversible mistake. She attempted to bypass me, contacting a client directly, boasting about her family connections. She thought her charm could compensate for skill. Her name could open doors where effort could not. She was wrong. The deal fell apart. The client asked for explanations. My mother and father, already subtly reliant on me, called me in. I smiled, offered the solution, and corrected the situation without blame. I watched her face as she realized that the invisible strings I held were stronger than she imagined. Panic flashed in her eyes. Fear, though quiet, took root. She understood at last that the sister she had always dismissed was now untouchable in ways she couldn't comprehend. It was then that I began planting the final seeds of consequence. I suggested restructuring certain family finances, directing investments, and creating oversight that only I controlled. They agreed without question. Every decision became filtered through me. Every success attributed to my guidance. My presence was now indispensable. And yet they still thought they were in control. My mother believed she was exercising judgment. My father believed he was maintaining authority. Marissa thought she could charm and manipulate her way out of this shift. They were blissfully unaware that every move they made now played directly into my hands. I had reached a point of quiet satisfaction. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer the child cast aside. I had built a network of influence, observation, and control that my family could not see. And every day I refined it. Every smile, every polite nod, every act of seeming generosity was calculated. And still I waited. Because revenge isn't about immediate gratification. It's about timing. It's about patience. Waiting until your opponent believes they are secure before delivering the consequences is the difference between satisfaction and disaster. I looked at my family one night across the dining table, all of them laughing, all of them relying on me without knowing it, and I realized the trap was no longer theoretical. It was set. And now it was only a matter of when, not if, the final pieces would fall. The day began quietly, the kind of morning that feels ordinary until everything changes. My family didn't know it yet, but nothing about that day would be ordinary for them. My parents and Marissa were bustling around the house, discussing finances, obligations, and future plans, all under the assumption that I was simply the helpful, successful daughter who had come back into their lives. They had no idea I had been building a silent empire of influence behind the scenes. I watched them from the kitchen doorway, a cup of coffee warming my hands, and let the realization settle. They were finally dependent. Every decision, every opportunity, every mistake now passed through me. I wasn't just a participant anymore. I was the axis of their lives. And this time I wouldn't let them forget it. Marissa was the first to show signs of panic. She tried to control a minor investment decision herself, thinking her charm could override the rules I'd put in place. She didn't realize she'd already agreed to the system I had designed. The client called for clarification, and suddenly Marissa was fumbling. Her usual confidence faltered. She looked at me across the table, searching for answers, hoping I would rescue her, just as she had always expected me to do for her as a child. Smiled. "I can help," I said, calm and collected, "but you have to follow the process." Her shoulders slumped. The unspoken truth was clear. She had always underestimated me, and now she had no choice but to submit. My parents watched in silent awe. They didn't question me, didn't interfere. They had come to rely on me in ways they had never imagined. Every project, every decision, every ripple of consequence now funneled through me. The balance of power had shifted entirely. Subtly, naturally, inexorably. That afternoon I called a family meeting under the guise of collaboration. Marissa arrived, hesitant, trying to maintain a semblance of control. My parents brought documents and spreadsheets, thinking they were participating in strategy discussions. They didn't know they were walking into the culmination of years of planning, a reckoning disguised as guidance. I began by reviewing finances, investments, and obligations. I asked questions, made suggestions, and redirected decisions. Each correction, each subtle nudge, reinforced the structure I had built. My family followed along, believing they were contributing. In reality, every choice cemented my authority. I was the one with the power to approve or deny, to correct or allow. Marissa made another attempt, a desperate plea for autonomy, masked as enthusiasm. She tried to bypass me, thinking she could appeal to my parents directly. I let her talk, listened carefully, then offered a single calm correction. The room went silent. She realized immediately that the only voice that mattered was mine. Her frustration was palpable, her pride wounded, her reliance on me undeniable. Finally, I addressed my parents directly. "From now on," I said quietly, "all financial and business decisions that involve the family must go through me. This isn't personal. It's about efficiency and clarity. I know you'll understand." They nodded, relief and trust written clearly on their faces. They didn't see it, but what I had just done was irreversible. I wasn't just involved in their lives. I had become essential. Marissa sat silently, her jaw tight, realizing that the golden child she had always believed herself to be no longer had that place. She looked to my parents for support, but they, too, were aligned with me. Every habit, every manipulation they had ever used was now ineffective. I had learned to observe, wait, and act with precision. They were finally in my world, not the other way around. Later that evening, when the house quieted and the family went to their separate rooms, I reflected on the years it had taken to arrive here. I thought of every snub, every unseen tear, every year I had spent building my independence in silence. I thought of the nights I had worked until my hands ached, the sacrifices I had made, the patience I had cultivated. All of it had led to this moment, the day I finally claimed what was rightfully mine. Not just recognition, not just respect, but power, control. The crown I had been denied as a child was now firmly in my hands. I smiled to myself, thinking of Marissa, still struggling to understand that her privileges no longer dictated the rules. I thought of my parents, finally acknowledging my authority without needing to voice it. And I realized something essential. Revenge doesn't always have to be loud or violent. Sometimes it's quiet, precise, and perfect. As I walked to the window overlooking the garden I had once tended as a child, the garden my family had always praised Marissa for noticing, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The invisible child, the forgotten daughter, had become the one who held everything. And as I prepared to close the door on the past for good, I knew the final lesson had been learned by everyone at that table. Underestimate me once, and I might forgive. Underestimate me twice, and you'll find that patience can be more dangerous than anger. Because I wasn't just Elena anymore. I was the woman they should have feared. If you thought my journey was shocking, wait until you see what happens when power and patience collide. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next story of calculated revenge and justice served cold.